Please welcome to the stage CEO of Walltopia, Ivayo Saltyrov.
Hello, it's working. My name is Ivo Sutirov with Walltopia Adventure. And first I want to thank all of the TEA staff members for making this event not only possible, but outstanding. When we talk about team entertainment, obviously we want to tell a story. We want to make sure people feel special and feel something unique. One of the ways to do so is through perspective and through architecture, the connection that someone may have and the ability to relate to a circumstance. These things can make a bunch of steel come alive. Walltopia prides itself in a design and innovation. We create destinations that are not active but interactive, providing an experience for all ages within a close proximity for any and every family. We are known for being the largest climbing wall manufacturer in the world. Beautiful attractions that have passed over Walltopia Adventure Division, creating unique attractions. Through themed climbing, artificial caving, roller coaster hybrids, ropes courses, and others, we start the same way, a foundational idea that evolves into a fantastic design, relate into a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Thank you.
Please welcome back York State Co-Chair Nathan Jones.
All right, thank you. So as much as we think about those iconic attractions out there associated with the parks and the design features, oftentimes it's the little things that go unnoticed out there. It's not about exactly what they do in terms of architecture, it's sometimes about the questions that they ask. Who is your audience? What do you want that audience to experience? How do you want them to experience it? Before pencils ever hit paper, the role of architecture is crucial in outlining not only the overall experience, but the storytelling aspect of what happens the moment the customers walk in the door. Layering on aspects such as culture, environment, guest expectations, the art of weaving meaning and magic into the ultimate guest experience truly becomes a three-dimensional puzzle that architects play such a prominent role in creating. As one of the pillars of the SATE formula, architecture speaks to the core of how ideas are realized and brought to life. Now, much of the World's Fair architecture was designed to last, to be a standing monument, as recognized right here in Seattle as one of the remnants of the 1962 World's Fair. And that was the International Fountain, originally designed to symbolize mankind's efforts to explore the farthest reaches of outer space, and since modernized for the 21st century. We'll be holding a SATE photo op there for everyone, 1:30 sharp. It's a 1-minute walk directly behind me, so following the next panel, visit, have lunch, eat, drink, network, then come join us again 1:30 sharp before we return for the second half of the day. Now up next is a member in support of the TEA, Gary Wachowski, CEO and head creative of Hotop Associates. Gary is a proud local. You're loud local too. He's a proud local and is very excited to be able to share with us, the story of Seattle Center and the World's Fair. Gary is a stalwart of the community within TEA. He is absolutely intelligent. He's devilishly handsome. Gary, I can't read your handwriting. Why don't you just come on out? Yeah, okay, you just. Good job.
Before, but that's good. Thank you. It's great to be here, and I'm happy to be the official local yokel of the day. Although I live here, I spend a lot of time on the road, like a lot of you, so instead of looking at views like this, I spend most of my time looking at this. And I heard a lot of people talking last night about how far Seattle is away from everywhere. So thank you very much for making the journey up to my hometown for SATE this year. I actually am not from here. Originally, I'm from New Jersey, and I moved out here about 15 years ago. My wife and I lived in a fourth-floor walk-up in Queens after living in the Midwest first, and we were ready for a change, and I said, well, where should we go? And she had, for really no apparent reason, her heart set on moving to Seattle, and I liked being married, so here we are. So we set out here and kind of built our home, and really move out there. There we go. So we've been here since then. I fell in love with this city really right away. I think the culture, I knew about the coffee, but I didn't know about the beer until I got here. So that's been really exciting to see that grow. And we got a little house up there. Seattle's a very hilly place, which I didn't know that either before I moved in here. So I was lucky enough to live in a high elevation and have a view of the Space Needle right behind us. But this isn't the view from my house. It's this. It's there, though. It's there. Wait, let me zoom in. There we go, a little closer. Can you see it? No. There it is, over there. And it's actually not really from my house either. So let's see. There's my house, and I got to go outside over there, up the street, and out into the middle of the road. Wait, oh, there's one more arrow. There it is. And that's how I get to see this beautiful view. But what's great is that view. Hold on, we're going backwards. Let me get that there. There we go. This view, though, is actually really special to me and to my family. So in Seattle, the Space Needle is really in the center of the town, and if Seattle was a theme park, it would be Cinderella's Castle. But we only have a nighttime spectacular twice a year. We have one on the 4th of July and one on New Year's Eve. So every year on the 4th of July, my family has our barbecue in our backyard, and we blow stuff up, and we wait for it to get dark, and then, which is like at 10:15 here also, so it takes a while. But once it gets dark, we go out in the street, and our friends and neighbors tend to gather there all in that spot, and the view is really stinky, but it's still kind of magical because it's going on all over the city. We gather around and people watch it, and it fulfills that purpose of really anchoring the town. I can't imagine what Seattle would be like without it as its icon, and it really it creates a moment where the city comes together those 2 times a year. That needle and Seattle Center are really part of the fabric of this town. And I think it's partially because it does 2 things. It's a time capsule, and yet at the same time, it's constantly changing and filling the needs of the community and the people that live here. But I really didn't think about it for a long time. When I first moved here, it really was not on my radar for a while. I didn't think about the Space Needle. I didn't think about Seattle Center. It was just a place. And then in 2009, there started to be some controversy in the news here, local politics, about what to do with a place called the Fun Forest. And the Fun Forest was a tiny little amusement park that was very close to here, right under the Needle. And it was a relic from the '62 World's Fair, Century 21, and it was going out of business. Nobody wanted to go there anymore. And the discussion became about when we looked at what they were going to replace it with. The discussion was really all about who's the audience. Are we building something for tourists, or are we building something for the people of the city? Because Seattle Center has really always kind of done both. We have these attractions and things, but there was a lot of competing point of views, and so it was, there we go, there's a picture too of, there's the Fun Forest itself was the midway part of the World's Fair. So generally at that time, all World's Fairs had an amusement park-like area that was reserved for entertainment and things like that. And the one in Seattle, in a fantastically dated fashion, was called the Gayway, which is a name that I don't think would use anymore for that. So the fair itself really was originally created to introduce modern Seattle to the world. The idea was to show the natural surrounding and also to promote the space age technology that was booming here with the space race. So that was kind of the surface level. This is what the fair is all about. But really, there was an ulterior motive. So there we go. Because the fair itself was kind of a Trojan horse. There was a group of community leaders and people who had felt that Seattle needed a downtown arts and culture mecca. There wasn't anything anchoring it. There wasn't any center to the city, the way it was spread out, the way it was designed. And really, for a few decades, there had been constant efforts to try to put that together, and it hadn't happened. And they realized that, hey, wait, if we can get a World's Fair here, not only can we get the city to give us the property, we can get the public behind it, but we can get the federal government to pay for a lot of it. So that's what they did. So they put together a team, and they found a spot, which is right where we are at the base of Queen Anne Hill. Ironically, it was not the best spot to feature the natural beauty of Seattle. You can't see the mountains here, you can't see the water from here, but it was a really good spot for what they knew that they wanted to leave behind. So they figured out where the spot was going to be. At that point, part of the effort then was going and getting official accreditation for the fair. At the time, and even now in the early 20th century, the Bureau of International Expositions was formed. And that's the accrediting body that says, yes, this is an official World's Fair. And it mattered for promotion, for attendance, and really to get the presence on the world stage that they were after. But they had a lot of things going against them. First of all, this site is really small. It's 70 acres here. And some of the fairs up to the date, they've been hundreds of acres, 900 acres. And this was a 70-acre site. The other thing going on at the time, too, was that the World's Fair has always had these kind of eras of different themes. So it started in the 1850s with industrial age themes. After the turn of the century in World War I, it became about cultural exchange. But things had changed in the world, in the 20 years since the last time there was a fair. There was the Cold War going on and the space race. So, there was this inward-looking movement where people were saying, we don't want to really be promoting, or we were struggling, I should say, in international relations at the time, and it made the politics complicated. They were trying to create energy and excitement around the space age and the space race. So that's became the theme. So Joseph Gandy was a community leader who had been chosen to be the president of the committee. So Joseph Gandy actually moved to Paris, spent a year there doing politicking and fighting hard to get accreditation for the fair. That's him, looking very official, pointing his finger at that piece of paper. But he was successful. He was able to, he was also a used car salesman, I forgot that part. So he was a lawyer, he really was, and I think it helped him. So even though they had the small site, a change in theme, and actually the BIE, they didn't even understand where Seattle was when he came and said, we want to put the fair in Washington. They thought he meant the other Washington, and wanted to know if it would be by the Washington Monument. So he had to explain all that. So obviously, spoiler alert, they got it, and they got their accreditation, and the fair was a huge success. In fact, it was one of the most successful fairs in fair history. So what did the Century 21 achieve that we can aspire to? Firstly, they educated masses of people, and they entertained masses of people. It was a huge attendance success. And they also delivered this optimistic message, people leaning into the space age and being positive about technology and the future and the utopian ideal of using technology to go to the moon, to explore the world, and not just the fear that was being driven with technology around the atomic bomb. It was a business success, so the fair was 6 months long, and it had made back its investment and become profitable halfway through, and after the 6 months, there were 9.5 million attendees. So that's a pretty good record for a 6-month event. And then, of course, they innovated technologically. Not only the Space Needle, but that, which is 605 feet tall and 100 yards from here. We're all going to go there tonight. And just in and of the story, that story in and of itself is miraculous. In terms of technological innovation and engineering. But there's a more broad kind of bucket of things that influence the industry that we all work in, and the list is long, but just to name a few: master planning, theme park design, ride design and technology, narrative storytelling through physical space, museum design, trade show design, science centers, and immersive experiences. They can all trace their roots back to something that was relevant and kind of came of age through the fairs. The most direct touch point of our industry in the fairs were the 62 fair here and 64 in New York. Those fit, I call it the Disney sandwich. So they started Disneyland in 1955, opened, and Disney World in 1971, and those two fairs were right in between. So when they were building the 62 fair, they went and looked at Disneyland, and then all the people from Disneyland and engineers and Walt himself came up here and were looking at the World's Fair here. And then that influenced, and he poached a lot of the talent to go build the fair in New York, and then that all transferred to the development of Disney World. So the idea that cross-pollination of the fair and the theme park world and the talent and the development in the industry starts to look at professions that didn't exist before that inflection point. Of course, not everything from the fair's history is positive or so rosy. There was a lot of racism, there was a lot of cultural insensitivity. Specifically, 1904 in St. Louis is known as the low point for fairs, where really primitive cultures were put on display in human zoos and treated with complete disrespect. And that era ended by the time we got to 62 and the World's Fair here, but there was still a set of challenges there. So in the 62 World's Fair, even though the cultural issues were not as prominent, they had the men's entertainment area where you had, just in time, you didn't get to see the men's entertainment area. There it is. So it was actually started by a woman who was a local legend for the brothel she operated, and somehow she got funding and opened up this area. So they had dirty puppet shows, they had peep shows, they actually had father-son night. It's like Tuesdays or something, where you could go and take your son to a peep show. So there's a long way to go. And obviously, when we talk about these kinds of things, first of all, in addition to all that, really, who were the planners planning this fair for? And here's a really shot of some happy fairgoers on the monorail going to the fair, and I think they really represent who the audience was. It was the white middle class. It was the see the USA in your Chevrolet Pacific Coast. They were expecting largely the West Coast to be the audience, people that were going on their summer vacations and driving up here, but there really was no attention paid to really making it broad appeal to anybody, and that included even locals. I think even the people living in the shadow of the Space Needle were not really proportionately represented as audience members. So why does that happen? Here's the picture of the committee that planned the fair. I would like to think that in the 60 years since then that we have made a good amount of progress in terms of creative teams and how we look at the people around us and try to reflect that in the attractions we create. The fair itself changed again in tone and spirit as it had in the past. So by the 70s and 80s, it was a little bit back to international branding or nation branding, nation promotion. So the cultural representations became much more accurate and honest and I think sensitive. Now, fairs have changed again. So the fairs and expos that are going on in the world today are largely around ecological themes and the environment and around building the green economy, which is, I think, obviously an important message and something we want to see more audiences flocking to participate and understand. But unfortunately, especially in this country, the appetite or even the interest in World's Fairs has fallen off the map. When I told people I was talking about World's Fairs, to a person, everybody I asked said, there's still World's Fairs? That's a thing? I think that's something that would help be important to change, given the message that's going on, that the fairs are around right now. If we really want to make a positive change in the world and expose that, we know how powerful the attractions and exhibits that we create are. And I think if we were to bring that entertainment back, there hasn't been a fair in the US since 1984, which is also why nobody heard of one lately, but I think that as it's shifted to be about something that matters to all of us, our work, or if we can find a way to, obviously we're not going to go to the BIE and bring the fair back to the US, but I think when you combine the skill set and the messaging of what's going on now, you could start to create change. And I think that that's really the common denominator of the fairs. The fairs and expos of yesterday challenged their audience's dream. Their creators had visions that they turned into realities. The places they created entertained, educated, and immersed the audience in optimistic worldviews where they could see the future. Throughout their history, fairs and expos have dared to try and change the world. And here in Seattle, they actually did it. The legacy that that fair left behind has impacted generations of people. Families like mine, but the entire cross-section of Seattle really spends time and energy in the legacy and on the bones of that fair that stand beneath our feet. There's cultural institutions, there's park space, there's arts institutions, there's entertainment. It really is a place that is for everybody in the city. So I think the takeaway for me is, as creators and builders of worlds, I think we can look to the fairs and see that interest in educating, entertaining at the same time, but really looking aspirationally to build a legacy and leave something behind after the things that we create are over, is something that we could all aspire to. So thank you. So I have a few experts that I brought to kind of extend this conversation. People know a lot more about this. I've kind of taken my own college course in the last 3 months. So I'd like to introduce Knut Berger, the official historian of the Space Needle and local legend, if you ask me. Carissa Baker, professor of tourism and theme park historian. Alan Stein, also historian and author, who runs a website called HistoryLink. And Free Forgendam, who is the chief development officer at Makoto. You can sit here, Alan.
Oh, wait, we didn't do the dance.
Oh, no,
yeah,
gotta
there
be
was
had
no
the whole
dance.
Dance, yeah.
So, Knut, I want to start with you and the Space Needle. I know that you were here witness at the creation, and you've told me some of those stories of being 8 years old and coming to the fair. The quote you said was, it was as if a spaceship from a friendly future had landed in my own backyard. Can you just kind of tell us a little bit more about specifically the Needle and its history and kind of what your experience was like?
Yeah, I was born and raised in Seattle, 8 years old, as you said. I'd seen the Space Needle under construction as a Cub Scout from a building on the opposite end of town. And in those days, you could see from one end of Seattle to the other. Now, if you go up the Space Needle, you can't. All you see are the skyscrapers. You have to think about the context in which it was built. It was a structure designed to kind of create the actual experience of the space age. The Space Needle top design, the flying saucer phenomenon started here in Washington State, 1947, with Kenneth Arnold sighting flying saucers on Mount Rainier.
Pre-Roswell.
Pre-Roswell. And the term flying saucer came from that. And so they wanted something that represented an advanced civilization that could travel between planets. The design of it was very experiential in the sense that the elevators were on the outside, yet they went up some of the exterior structure. And so and they were capsules, so it was kind of designed to be space capsule-like with windows. And this was really novel in 1962. So when you got into the space capsule and went up, you didn't go very fast, but everybody gasped because you felt like it was liftoff. And then you ended up in a place, it was the first freestanding, rotating restaurant in the world. So when you went up there, if you dined, it would go around. It took about an hour to go around. And then when you went out on the observation deck, which you guys will see later if you haven't already. In the original Space Needle, observation deck was completely open. And so you had this thrilling view from 500 feet of the city and the surroundings.
So on the other, like, there's the design story, but also the kind of the business story. I know that it was mentioning that the purpose and function of the fair, one of them was to promote the Pacific Northwest, which you couldn't see right from the ground.
Right.
So you had to get people up in the air. And it was a fairly late addition, right, to the fair in terms of when they landed on design and when they started. And that we've talked about this, and the question with my professional brain went on, well, who paid for it, was where I went to, because it was kind of this thing that wasn't in what was the public funding, right?
Yeah. So, the designers of the fair knew that they were going to need a signature structure. All the successful fairs had one. The Eiffel Tower was really the model, but the Crystal Palace, Trilon, and Perisphere from the '39 New York World's Fair, they knew that they needed something that would be a signature. They also wanted it to be permanent, like the Civic Center that would survive after the fair. So they wanted something like the Eiffel Tower that was built to last. And they didn't know where to put it. They didn't know what it was going to be until the last minute. They didn't know how to pay for it. When the concept was announced, they had nothing in place as far as that. So the public entities that might pay for such a thing were already tapped out with other fair costs. And so it was a group of 5 local investors, and it was kind of funny. It's space age, but the investors were all people who had made money in timber. And, Weyerhaeuser family and the shipbuilding Skinner family, that kind of thing, old school Northwest. But they put in money. So the Space Needle is still privately owned by the family of one of those original 5 investors. And I think it's in such good shape today, probably because it's private. I think if, King County, where Seattle is, owned it, it'd probably be rusting and paint peeling and God knows what.
Yep. So, Chris, we were talking about the Space Needle, and I made the analogy to Cinderella's Castle. Obviously, like that big icon is a direct tie-in to theme park creation and the history of that, or the overlaps between the fairs and that world. What are the other kind of direct, more sort of technological or innovative-based things that you connect to those two places?
Right. So I don't know if you have my first slide.
Oh, I do. Let's see if we can find it. Let's see.
So there's actually a lot of connections. My students are always very surprised that there's any connections between these things. Again, the World's Fair, kind of how you mentioned, what the heck is that, right? Those still exist, right? So my students always say that, but they're always shocked when they come up with, and they start seeing some of these inventions that were done for the fair originally, but then made their way into the theme park. So I think of, if all of you could see the image on the right, this is the Mario-Rama, really interesting immersive experience where you have this kind of motion base, it's going back and forth, you have sounds, you actually had the smells of seaweed that were kind of pumped into the room to make you feel like you were really on the deck of a ship. This is from the 1900 Paris exhibition. We're talking about 1900. This is a long time before Disneyland, right? So students are interested in that. Maybe some of you are familiar with the other two here. On top, Hale's Tours and Scenes of the World, which is really one of the very first simulators. This is also a type of film, the travel film, where the idea is you're kind of watching people traveling, and in this case you felt like you were really on a train, but then it also, again, had the motion base. It had fans to put these effects in your face so that you really felt that you were there. And then my very favorite, I think, early attraction, students are always shocked to see this one, is A Trip to the Moon, 1901. And it's got a pre-show, it's got merchandise, it's kind of the first dark ride experience. There were many dark ride experiences at World's Fairs and exhibitions, but this one was so immersive because you had the pre-show, you had a post-show where you were on a papier-mâché moon, and you were mingling with the Selenites, okay? So I find this so interesting. So I'm assuming most of us were not alive during any of these, and yet these are kind of immersive attractions. So if you want to hit the next slide. I could talk about this for hours. I am a university professor, but I will respect your time. But you already mentioned the Ferris wheel. The Ferris wheel comes from, I think the World's Columbian Exhibition in 1893 is so important to the history of theme parks. That's the first midway, the idea of having midway attractions on a midway. Even things like the souvenirs and the food that you get. Most people don't realize that the Belgian waffle, for instance, was created also for a World's Fair. So a lot of really cool stuff. You already mentioned the Trilon and Paris Fair, Canute. So in 1939, a lot of my students have said, oh, it's Epcot. Well, not quite, but it is this really big, imposing kind of structure that, excited people and often would reflect the values of the fair. Attraction posters, people collect attraction posters, right? The World's Fairs have phenomenal attraction posters, right? That will often represent, the values of that. And then a really random and little known one is actually this 1939, not sanctioned by the BIE, San Francisco exhibition where Walt Disney saw this thorn, and this you can see the postcard that represented this show, the Thorn exhibition of miniatures. This is all these miniature little towns and scenes and spaces. And so Walt Disney said, I want one of these too. I want to call it Disneylandia. Okay, and so there's where he comes up with the name. So I could go on, but even basic stuff that we don't think of, having a turnstile, having ticket takers, having security, again, having a midway, just some of the basic stuff we associate with the amusement industry really started in the sphere of World's Fairs and exhibitions.
And what about on the philosophical side, less technological, but in that aspirational or that technological utopianism?
Right. So if you want to hit my last side there, you probably knew in this section you would see some Walt Disney exhibits from the 1964-1965 New York World's Fair. And to me, these exemplify some of the common themes that you see in the fair. So it's a small world. We all know that. I won't start singing, I promise. Okay. But maybe I should, because the idea of nations coming together, it's a small world, we're looking at each other's diversity, but also kind of coming together. That is something that a World's Fair was about. The middle, we think of very much audio animatronics as being this kind of staple of the amusement or theme park industry, and yet, Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln starts at this World's Fair. And then finally, Progress Land, Carousel of Progress. Just a show of hands, how many of you have been on that at Magic Kingdom? Carousel of Progress? Nice. So you're going on an actual World's Fair attraction, right? And it's talking about progress. There's a great, big, beautiful tomorrow shining at the end of every day, right? So very much indicative. And I'll throw the last one in, is, there's a lot of corporate sponsorship in World's Fairs, right? There's a lot of consumerism in World's Fairs. So that's maybe not always good, but it's certainly a value that kind of translated to those two mediums.
Yeah, and that 64 World's Fair, right, where Disney had 4 exhibits, that was not a sanctioned fair. So somebody had to pay for it. So that's why you got to see the dinosaurs in your Ford Mustang, which I couldn't believe when I found out that was a thing, but that's what it was called. And okay, right? So, Alan, I talked about the fairs always having a larger theme or some kind of vision. Were they always aspirational or altruistic, or were some of them more practical?
Well, I can't really speak for all World's Fairs, but I can give the examples of the 2 World's Fairs that Seattle had. And we had the 1909 World's Fair, 1962 World's Fair. 1909 was you have to really look at the prior 20 years, the transformation that had gone on in the city. I'll just give a condensed history of what happened. But in 1889, there was a big fire that destroyed downtown Seattle. That same year, Washington became a state. So the city's rebuilding, now in brick and stone. Then a nation with the Depression hit. We had the Panic of 1893. Everything gets put on hold. And then by pure luck, gold is discovered in Alaska in 1897. And Seattle becomes the jumping off point. In order to get to Alaska and the Yukon, you had to come to Seattle. You had to buy your provisions here, spend all that money here, and go up there. So this transformed the city. It now is becoming, rather than an old Wild West town, it's becoming a burgeoning metropolis. Mm-hmm. And in 1907, they started annexing, and that's really the beginnings of Seattle as a city. So in 1909, they had this World's Fair to show off, and say, look at what we've done 20 years ago, nobody knew where this was. People still didn't know where it was, but this was a changing period in this time. So that was the promotion of the fair, was to have all these people come out, show what Washington had to offer, its industry, its agriculture, and every county had an exhibit at the fair. And then the benefit that came from it was that they built this fair on the new University of Washington campus. So what they got as a result of this was, after the fair is over, what happens when the fair is done? Mm-hmm. Well, after the fair is done, then you have this grounds of this campus, and now 100 years later, you can still go up there, and it's the footprint for that campus.
So is that where they got the idea for 62?
And exactly, that's what I was just going to say. That sort of ties in with 62, because from 1909 to 1962, that's only 50 years or so, and there were people that were kids at the 1909 fair who are now in positions of authority in Seattle, who said, hey, we'd put that fair on back in 1909. Why can't we do that again? Mm-hmm. So it was originally planned as a kind of a celebration, a 50th anniversary celebration of the 1909 fair. That was one aspect of it. But again, as luck would have it, Sputnik gets launched during the planning phases of this, and that gives them their theme. Now the theme is the Space Age World's Fair. And, and plus that's a lot more exciting than, a bunch of old-timers talking about 1909. This is the future. And so now they have this fair. But really, throughout all that, the underlying motivation for the 1962 World's Fair, sure, it brings people out here. Sure, they come and spend money. Sure, they can come out and see what Seattle is like. But the planners were looking at having a civic center when they were done. The same thing. Once the fair is done, what do you have left over? And that was their goal. The people that we talked to who worked on the fair back then all say the same thing. They said this was a civic center disguised as a World's Fair.
And everybody knew it that was working on it.
Yeah, that's what the goal was.
That's where the initial funding came from. It was a bond issue for a civic center.
Specifically that, and then they shifted it over.
And here we are. We have a center that has theaters. It has an arena. It actually did have an amusement park up until a couple of years ago. They did have rides here. So that was really the motivation. It was very specific that was what they wanted to have done.
So, I think a lot about the idea of that motivation, whether it's altruistic or otherwise, like that authorship, of when you're creating something, and now looking at our contemporary industry and saying, well, what is the value of doing something for a motive outside of profit? Right, and does it make the experience better? I know for you, we talked a lot about kind of the atomization of the theme park industry, where you're seeing these other things that are kind of overlapping to a more aspiring to, whether it's education or culture or art, where they're creators. And we use examples like Meow Wolf all the time. You talk about Sleep No More and these kind of successful attractions, maybe even Red, like we were talking about this morning, what do you think about the difference, as when you're working on something that is got its own, I don't want to say pure intent, because I think that's giving people too much credit, but is that creating more opportunity for access, to the audience,
access. That's an interesting one, especially because what really struck me about the presentation was the slide with the creators of the 62 World Fair, right? And I could not relate to that at all. And it's interesting because you have to look at everything in context. You see an experience that was designed to inspire people and to get them sort of open to the world, edutainment, right? Showing them prisms of society, of technology, of thinkers, of innovators through the lens of whatever the highest bidder was, the sponsor, the brand, whoever was actually designing it or coming up with a plan for it. So the context, at least within that space, was 1962. And remember, 1962, there was a lot of polarization that was happening at the time, something that's not too far off from where we are today, right? But I think the difference now is that our audience is different, right? And I look at this generation that isn't necessarily linked to years of when you were born, but a sort of common denominator, right? We are the post 9/11 generation that's defined culturally by fear, by war, by being very sort of sensitive to what's happening in the world and our place in it. So it's these aspirationals that are typically Gen Xers, millennials, but they're a huge population. And they are interested in understanding how they can have status, but how they can align themselves with experiences that matter, experiences that are sustainable, that have a sort of a bigger purpose. So I think the connective tissue isn't so much how it can be different in terms of creating access now, but rather who's the audience and how do you speak to that audience in a way that's compelling. So the more successful experiences I find, yes, provide agency, and yes, I believe Daniel spoke earlier about how people learn through fun, yes, and as entertainers, our responsibility is to look at how we create that fun and not reduce experiences in a way that can actually eliminate and alienate, and that could also risk being a stereotype. So how do you create these immersive experiences and create access more from the decision-making side rather than the content that I'm putting out? Like, I'm more interested in how do we make sure that the doors to who's actually creating and signing the check are more diverse as opposed to the content that we're putting out for people to experience and engage with. And I think once we are able to look at access from that prism and be able to understand who are the actual, how do we change that photo to 2019 and looking beyond, that's when we start having more compelling conversations for me.
One of the impetuses for getting funding for the fair from the federal government was dissatisfaction with the 1958 exhibition, World's Fair in Brussels. And the scientific community was really unhappy because the American pavilion contained a lot of imagery that looked at America's social problem and racial problems. And they decided they didn't want a fair like that again. They wanted science to be at the forefront, which is why the science theme was adopted in Seattle, because that was where they could get the money from the Eisenhower administration and then the Kennedy administration. And the space race and the Cold War kind of all played into that because they wanted to show the world that, we weren't the Soviet Union and that we had good things going on. But I think there was a way in which getting everybody focused on the future was a way of not looking at the present.
They were putting their head
And
in
the present had some very uncomfortable things in it that we were to look past. And Bobby Kennedy came to the World's Fair. He spoke to the Downtown Business Organization here. And he told people of Seattle in this thing, he said, you guys are lucky because you have no history.
Huh.
You have left all that behind. You are looking forward into the future. So people were actually told that knowing our history and relating to our history was actually baggage.
That's rather troubling.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's a really great African proverb that essentially, I'm paraphrasing, but it essentially says, until the lion learns to write, history will be told by the hunter, right? And it's that notion of like escapism, yes, but you have to understand where you're escaping to by acknowledging where you're running from or coming from. And it's a balance because as themed immersive designers, whether it's theme parks or brand experiences or live events or what have you, there has to be a veneer that's finished, that's polished, that makes it feel fun and makes it feel accessible. And I'm always curious as what's that line of informing and enlightening and educating as opposed to just entertaining people while being true to history and fact. And first, we also have to agree that science is important and that there's truth behind it. But it's a challenge because I don't know what that line is.
I think a lot of times you start designing an attraction and there's this question about the spectrum, and are we having fun or are we teaching somebody something, and you slide that fader, and I think maybe the goal is to not have that fader, but to figure out how to do those things simultaneously, which is hard to do, right?
Yeah.
Great, so we're gonna take some time to take some questions now, which I think we're gonna try out for the first time, the TEA question app. So we're gonna see how that goes. So I think that anything that's been sent in, somebody wrote down and they're gonna bring out to us to answer. Haha. And if that doesn't work, we'll improvise. Look, it worked.
Questions.
Okay, so let's see what we got here. Who are World's Fairs for today? Who's the audience?
And that's interesting. And before we came out, we were talking about, who was
goes
the
to
kind
these
of
things?
primary target and audience who were talking about, especially socioeconomic status. This was a major factor in who actually visited these things, and I think that's kind of interesting. But I was interested in your observation about the change in World's Fairs and becoming less of an amusement zone and more of a kind of a showcase, technological
Commercial
showcase, maybe.
yeah.
But I'd say a national showcase, almost
Yeah.
nationalism kinds of things. So,
Yeah.
so who is the
And focus now on
audience?
ecology, but not in an activist way, but again,
Right.
back to using that technology and promoting the green economy, which is important, but I don't think it has the same, that's where the entertainment sometimes
Right.
is lacking, because I think it's hard to get people.
Yeah, it's the
interested.
Coachella effect. I mean,
Yeah.
it's sponsorship, so it's the person with the highest dollar that
Right.
essentially benefits from that. And I would argue that the spirit behind the World's Fair has actually transitioned into other more niche, gatherings.
What about like the ages of the people that come to World's Fairs? Because one thing I noticed when we were looking at the 62 World's Fair, this is rock and roll is happening, and there was so little rock and roll at the 1962. I mean, yeah, Elvis was here filming the movie, but you look at the musical events that were here, and it was all old white people music. It was
Don't hate.
not really, hip and young. I mean,
Right.
They actually had twist parties, but that was much later in the year. So they weren't gearing it for that age group.
Right. And I feel like not much has changed. I mean, I teach college students every day, and they're totally uninterested. I mean, I'd like to say something different, but they're not interested in a showcase of technologies or nation building or whatever it is. That's,
Well, I wonder, do you even need it? I mean, you think about, you can access innovation that's happening in India from your phone, right?
Yeah.
There's a way to connect with people that's very different, vastly different
Yes.
than you would have, 40, 50 years ago. So not to downplay its relevance now, but is it worth revisiting what actually is the message? Why does the World Fair need to happen, and then go from that lens?
You've been to so many. Do you think it's as aspirational as those earlier fairs you visited?
Well, they didn't start out particularly aspirational. If you look at the 1851 Crystal Palace, I mean, it was about trade. It was about colonization. It was a showcase of empire. And to some degree, that is still true. Business interests are the ones that really put on fairs, business and government interests. Who goes to the fairs? It's generally local, affluent, middle-class viewers, but it depends. I mean, I went to the biggest World's Fair ever held in Shanghai in 2010. 93 million people came to that fair. I was on site the day there were 1 million visitors on site in one day. There wasn't a lot of elbow room. But what was interesting was a lot of the people that came were clearly not affluent. The Chinese had really promoted getting people to the fair, and they had never seen a World Fair before. There had never been an expo in China, so you have this large population coming, and there was a sense of wonder that you don't see at a lot of the other expositions. So I think it depends on where they're held in terms of, and what their political motives
And
are.
what they're emphasizing, but they're always political in some way.
Yeah, absolutely.
I wonder if there's a way to transition from exposition to action somehow, where I think of 1 million people in one room, and you just go, oh my God, if each one of those people was able to do something or donate something or be something, how much of that could help move the needle forward, whatever that call to action is,
What
right?
does a World's Fair look like with a call to action attached to it?
Yeah.
There really
Right,
wasn't
especially
one.
when you look at visitation. I mean, it used to be that World's Fairs got more visitation than theme parks. I mean, that's far over
Right.
now, but
Yeah.
interesting.
So I was told to lean in this morning, so I'm going to ask this one. The space race was inequity, white and male, and I think a lot just like the fair planners we were talking about. What are the long-term impacts on a community when the new civic center is rooted in an exclusionary content and stories? It was a question, and I think we talked about putting our heads in the sand and that idea, and I've talked very positively about the legacy of this place that it left behind. And I know how does Seattle Center fulfill that mandate now to be for everybody? And I guess I have to ask the locals that question. But
What, I didn't catch the question.
How does it feel the mandate now to be for everybody, or to, we're saying the foundation of what that fair was, to a degree, was one about ignoring the culture that was going on in the world, and two, through an aspirational message, but one that wasn't, there was
a mix. There was that optimism,
right.
of the space race and all that, but it was rooted in Cold War jitters.
Right.
It's like when Sputnik was launched. People don't realize how terrifying that was.
Mm-hmm.
The Russians have, if they can launch a satellite, what else can they launch?
Sure.
And even here at the fair in the Coliseum, there was the state exhibit was this ride through the future, of sorts. And there, it ended with, what are the possibilities for the future? And one was a bright, sunshiny day, and the other was a nuclear bomb going off.
With doom and gloom. But I guess, I think what this is about, and what I'm kind of asking is now, because we live here and we see people carrying on, the Seattle Center is a living thing. And we still have some of those same challenges, with, and, this city, I don't know where it falls in diversity relative to other cities in the country. I think probably in the middle of the pack. And my personal observation at Seattle Center is that it is fairly cross-cultural who I see there now.
Yeah.
But can you guys speak at all to that legacy?
Yeah, I mean, there was a struggle over what the Civic Center would be. Even during the fair, they were arguing about which interest was going to run it. I mean, it's essentially a park, and it's changed a lot. I mean, the Fun Forest brought kids of all races and all types to the center, and so there's a skate park, there's a children's play area. I mean, I think it's considered very family friendly, but it's evolving. The area around Seattle Center is developing. We're near South Lake Union. You've got the Gates Foundation right next door, and other tech companies moving into the area. And so there's been a struggle over does it become more integrated with the neighborhood? Does it become more like, or do we create public park space within the center? And the debates around that, as over the removal of the Fun Forest and the replacement, the building of the Chihuly Museum, these things create great civic controversy because people are seeking a kind of more equitable landscape. And Seattle is not. I mean, in 1960, Seattle was 90+% white. It's down, maybe 65% in King County, something like that. But it's still, it's also a city with a history of segregation and redlining and that kind of thing. So I think that it tends now to be kind of a very multicultural space, but there are other ideas that people are proposing or have proposed, like a Native American museum and things that I think speak to trying to make it more inclusive. That was
one of the things that was proposed for the Fun Forest, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
But this is the gathering place for, when something happens that affects a lot of people.
Yes.
After 9/11, where did people come in Seattle to grief? They came here. When Kurt Cobain died, there was a huge, where are we going to meet? We're going to meet at the Seattle Center and have an event. So if there's a rights march in downtown Seattle, it ends here. So this is kind of that hub for that.
Well, it is, and I think that's a good place to end. I think that those festivals that I talked about a little bit, where really I think that's a place where I know I'm not alone, and with that you feel connected on those moments when the Seattle Center is alive, the whole city comes alive, and I think that's
it's like a community function. That's fascinating to me because you think one of the key differences between World's Fairs and theme parks is they're not permanent.
Right.
But then this one has achieved some kind of permanence in that community.
That's maybe achieving goals that the original fair didn't touch. Great. Well, thank you guys very much. It's been great to talk to you all and learn about it very much. And thank you.